So UFC Fight Night Moreno versus Royval has just concluded, and I'm going to have to level with you guys here. The only fight I was really looking forward to on this card was Yair Rodriguez versus Brian Ortega. Because the winner of this matchup is going to be challenging for a title shot, eventually. We know for a fact Volk is going to get a rematch. The question is, when will that be? He said he wants to take time off, which he probably needs. He's notioning to rematching Ilia in Spain, which will probably be towards the end of the year. So, who knows, maybe we'll see Ilia defend his belt sometime mid-year or not. Maybe the next time he fights will be against Volkanovski at the very end of the year. Who knows? The only thing I was sure of, though, was honestly, I kind of wanted to see him fight Yair Rodriguez. And that is for the simple fact that going into the fight with Volkanovski, the one question that was certainly on my mind, and I'm sure it was on a lot of other people's minds as well, was how was Ilia going to deal with Volk's outside calf kicks? Because I watched every single Ilia Topuria fight there was on UFC Fight Pass in the lead up to his fight with Volk. And the one thing that stood out was that every time his opponents would throw a leg kick at him, they would land it. Every single time. And that is because Ilia, he stands like a boxer, as we all know by now. He's very heavy on that front leg, his stance is bladed, so that outside calf kick is always there. And like I said, his opponents would have success with it. Now, the issue is, Ilia would always knock them out very early on. Very, very few of Ilia's fights would ever make it past the first round, just because of how devastating his boxing is. So going into his fight with Volkanovski, I was very curious, because this seems like a weakness. This seems like a glaring hole in Ilia's fight style. So I was super curious how Ilia Topuria was planning on dealing with them. And Volkanovski didn't throw very many of them. His main focus that fight was to land inside kicks, and not just to the legs, but to the body and the head as well, which wasn't a bad strategy. Constantly forcing Ilia to block with his forearms could really wear them down and affect his boxing. And the inside leg kicks in concept were a good way to throw Ilia off guard, because Ilia and his team were most likely expecting outside leg kicks, like Volk has been shown to do so many times. But just like in all Ilia's other fights, we didn't really get to see the progression of this game plan from Volkanovski into the later rounds because Ilia knocked him out fairly quickly. So all the questions I and many others had about Ilia Topuria are still unanswered. And that is why I really wanted to see him fight Yair Rodriguez. Yair on paper would have presented some really interesting challenges for Topuria. And that is because if you are a fighter who primarily uses boxing to win your fights, a tall, rangy fighter with good movement and good kicks is your absolute worst nightmare. Because they just completely avoid the boxing aspect of mixed martial arts. They're going to stay far away from you, they're constantly going to circle, and they're only going to throw kicks. And it can be insanely difficult to get on the inside and effectively use your hands. So, going into this fight between Yair Rodriguez and Brian Ortega, I was rooting for Yair. I love Brian Ortega, his jiu-jitsu, absolutely off the charts. But I don't think there's any chance in hell he beats Ilia Topuria. On the feet, Ortega is pretty boxing heavy himself, and against someone to the level of Topuria, he would just get eaten alive. But the one thing about really high-level jiu-jitsu fighters is they have a very similar advantage to knockout artists. A knockout artist just needs to land that one punch to put you to sleep. Well, a jiu-jitsu fighter just needs one opportunity to jump on a submission, and then the fight can be over like that. But with that being said, Ilia would curb stomp him. I'm just being honest there. So I am rooting for Yair Rodriguez in this fight. And of course, Ortega gets my hopes up when he rolls his own ankle, jumping around before the fight starts. So at this point, I'm already celebrating in my head. Okay, cool. Ortega's done. He's out of there. And in the first round, it certainly looked that way. Yair is insanely fast and has a lot of power. He had caught Ortega clean, dropped him. Every time Ortega tried to clinch, he was ripping knees to the body. It got to the point eventually that Ortega sort of pulled guard, sort of got tripped, and I thought Yair was going to stay far, far away. But no, he engaged with Ortega on the ground and looked really good doing it. Ortega was constantly looking for triangles, but Yair was ready for it, and that is just, honestly, kind of a limitation when it comes to closed guard. There's just not a lot of submissions you can go for from there. I mean, what do you got in an MMA fight that you can actually hit consistently? Armbar triangle. That's pretty much it. So Yair looks really good from on top, but he eventually goes for what I can only assume was a knee slice. That's my best guess for what he was going for here, but it was not executed very well. He ended up getting kind of caught, and Ortega started taking his back. Yair kind of went for a last-second calf slicer, but there was really nothing there. And it was from there on that I got painfully reminded about Yair's serious weakness in the octagon. And why, let's just be honest, Ilia Topuria would absolutely murder him. It's because Yair does not have very good positional grappling, especially when it comes to wrestling. He's got good submissions off his back, but as you can tell, he completely upgraded his speed stat to the max, and therefore sacrificed a lot in the strength category. Because in his fight with Volkanovski, Yair looked actually, really dangerous on the feet. But those takedowns were coming way too easy for Volk. Volk was clearly the much stronger guy, and he really beat him up from on top, which really slowed Yair down and aided in Volk catching him with that hook, dropping him, and then finishing him. Basically the same thing when Yair fought Max Holloway. He looked super dangerous on the feet until Max started wrestling him. And starting in the second round, Ortega follows this same trend. He gets deep in on a double up against the fence, picks Yair up, slams him, controls him the entire round, does a good amount of damage, and then in the third round, hits him with that trip up against the fence, and then Yair just kind of looked like a baby off his back. Instead of bucking and hipping and trying to explode, Ortega was able to control him on top fairly easily, grabbed the arm triangle, passed over to the side, and that was it. And then it hit me. The featherweight division's kind of dead, isn't it? At this point, there are only two fighters that I would want to see face Ilia Topuria. And that, of course, is Max Holloway, who is already scheduled to have to go through the meat grinder that is Justin Gaethje. And then there is the undefeated Russian Movsar Evliev. And the only problem with Movsar, though, is he lost to Arnold Allen. He did not win that fight. He got some takedowns, sure, but he didn't do anything with the takedowns. And per the judging criteria, a takedown is not enough to be considered effective grappling. One must establish an attack with the takedown. Now, Movsar did not do this. Yet somehow he was still awarded the fight. And that's because MMA judges are horrible. And I truly don't think they even understand what their own criteria is sometimes. So, let me ask you guys, who is the next interesting competitor at featherweight for Ilia Topuria? Because, let's just be real here, Volk kind of cleared out the whole division. And then Ilia just cleared out Volk. And the one guy who I thought would be a serious stylistic counter to Ilia would, in all honesty, get destroyed in the grappling. So, the featherweight division might be dead.